We all live on campus now. Andrew C. Sullivan, the political commentator, wrote a couple of months back. So this is the perfect time to talk to Scott C. Johnston, the author of Campusland, a novel that deals with the campus craziness. Mr. Johnston also runs The Naked Dollar. He's a finance and tech guy who turned into a novelist. I'm very happy that I got the opportunity to talk to him, particularly since his book has now been opted for Hollywood production. So for the beginning of our conversation, I originally planned to pick out some of kind of the most prominent cases of the advancement of the woke brigades in the last couple of weeks, but it seems it's really hard to catch up. So just in the last couple of days, I found out that apparently The Bachelor is racist, math is racist, we need trigger warnings for The Muppet Show. We can no longer watch old Disney movies because they also need trigger warnings because they might be disturbing or traumatizing for children. So given all that's currently going on, I had to go back and reading your book, Campusland. I have to ask, can you tell us a little bit about how you came about writing that book and if you sometimes feel as if reality is overtaking your parodical, satirical look at what's going on at U.S. university campuses?
Sure. I'll tell you how it came about. I'm not a writer by trade at all, and I'd never written any fiction before. So I went to Yale as an undergraduate, and I also taught there as an adjunct for a few years, but not writing or anything. I taught economics. But I went back for a free speech symposium. It was called The Future of Free Speech. Now, mind you, it wasn't sponsored by Yale. Yale isn't into that sort of thing these days, nor any of the higher ed universities. But it was physically on Yale's campus. And 200 students showed up and tried to physically shut the conference down. They showed up with signs and they were chanting and they tried to break in, but were prevented by security. And as I was walking out through this phalanx of angry, even spitting students who, obviously missed irony class that day, they're trying to shut down they're using their speech to try and shut down a conference on free speech. I wondered why no one had written a really good satiric novel using this milieu, this setting, the modern, insane American university. Where was Tom Wolfe when you needed him? But Tom Wolfe had actually recently died, so that's where he was. And he did write a book about colleges called I Am Charlotte Simmons, but it was more like 14 years ago, and it wasn't one of his best books, and it wasn't about political correctness. But it didn't occur to me at the time that I might be the person to write that book. Then fast forward to my college reunion, and I was holding the door open one evening for an undergraduate, and she stopped dead in her tracks, and she looked at me and wouldn't go through the door and said, "Patriarchy." She accused me of patriarchal behavior for holding the door open for her. And we had this standoff where neither of us would go through the door. And eventually boredom overcame her principles before they overcame mine, and she walked through the door. But it was really that moment where I thought, well, the hell with it. I'll figure out a way to write a novel. And then I set about doing it. So that's how it came about. And I think it turned out to be pretty timely. Oh, and as far as events overtaking it, there were a lot of things as I researched the novel, and a lot of things that happen in the novel. The novel is supposed to be a fun read and supposed to make you laugh, but a lot of things that happen in it are based on real life events. And some of the things I had to tone down from reality because I didn't think anyone would believe them, even in a novel. For instance, the villain in my book is the Dean of Diversity and Inclusion at Devon University, which is kind of a Yale stand-in. And I was trying to decide how many subordinates to give her. Like, how big is the diversity department at this fictional Ivy League university? And so I went on the Harvard and Yale websites to find out how many there were in real life, and I could not find out the information. The diversity industry does not believe in transparency. And so I decided to make it 20, and then later on I revised it to 30, thinking, I have some license for satire here. I found out right around when the book came out about a year ago that the actual number of EL is 150. Now, if I put 150 in the novel, no one would have believed it. They would have said, come on, give us a break. That's ridiculous. So I toned a lot of stuff down, but in many respects, reality has blown right past my novel since it came out. The culture is moving very quickly.
I mean, I would also like to congratulate you, right? The book Campusland, and I will try for our listeners, I highly recommend this, but I'll try to avoid any spoilers that would take the fun out of reading it for themselves. But it was recently optioned by Hollywood. Now, did this come as a surprise to you? And do you expect the actual development of a movie script, given the current climate, that this is going to happen in the near future?
That's a good question. You probably know that the Oscars have changed their rules, and you basically can't win an Oscar anymore unless you have a woke narrative and you have a certain percentage of minority actors and so forth and so on. I think a big studio bought it. I don't think they would have bought it if they didn't want to see it made. As an author, I'm led to believe I'm on the lowest rung of the Hollywood totem pole. So they don't necessarily share a lot with me, although my understanding is right now they're looking for someone to write a screenplay treatment of it. And they want to make it into a series, sort of a Netflix series, which would be ideal, I think, because satire is very difficult to put on the big screen. And I would cite Tom Wolfe's Bonfire of the Vanities, the worst movie made of the best book ever. It's very difficult to get the tone right, and you need a little time to flesh it out. And there are a lot of characters in Campusland, and I think a 90-minute movie might be hard to do. But given the breathing room of a 7-part series or something, I think it would be fabulous. So, will it actually get made, and will there be actors and actresses courageous enough to accept roles in it? I don't know. I hope so.
I mean, do you think this is something that we might see just now emerging, and the movie about your book would fit right in there, that there is a new kind of conservative landscape in culture and movie making is emerging, right? We recently had on Netflix J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. Then Ben Shapiro's Daily Wire has producing Run, Hide, Fight, the movie about a school shooting. So it looks as if there is, which of course is also driven, which is fine, by some profit interest, but that there is a growing consumer base for maybe not conservative themed movies per se, but of movies that don't give in completely to the woke prescriptions and to political correctness, that maybe some studios say, listen, we know that this might give us some blowback, but at the same time, there is like this huge chunk of people out there who would really enjoy such a movie and who would watch it because it is politically incorrect.
Yes, so I'm of two minds on this. So yes, there'd be demand for it, but it is also the case that lots of American companies now are making, as a company, you're supposed to try and maximize profits within the bounds of ethics and the law. And a lot of companies are not doing that anymore. They're actually sacrificing profits for the sake of wokeness, so that 12 people on Twitter won't criticize them. So you see across industries a lot of suboptimal financial decisions being made, like Disney canceling that the one woman who was in the Star Wars.
Yeah, Gina Carano.
Right. I mean that she was very popular and she was making the money. So that was a suboptimal decision financially speaking. They did it to virtue signal. So there's a lot of that going on. But on the other hand, my book got published by a big publisher, which surprised a lot of people. I did not, whenever I reached a point in my book or when I was writing it where I thought, gee, am I going to get in trouble if I say this? I went ahead and said it. So my book is anti-woke, anti-PC, and it got published by St. Martin's Press, which is, part of Macmillan, which is one of the biggest publishers there is. So there is some hope, I think, and we're starting to see a bit of pushback on this entire woke revolution, but the pushback is in early days, and you've got to be kind of brave if you're pushing back, because the left still owns social media, and that's the tool that they use to cancel people.
I mean, do you think that, for example, companies like Coca-Cola, right? They recently had this company-wide anti-racism training where they had like a Robin DiAngelo, Ibrahim X. Kendi style training for its employees to be less white and to be be more aware of their privilege and all these kind of things, which of course are in itself incredibly racist. But do you think that these companies do it because they really believe in it, or that they say the likelihood of getting, for example, boycotted by a liberal group or by liberals is much higher than getting boycotted by conservatives, right? The likelihood of, if you don't do the anti-racism training, that you get a boycott from the left is higher than people now saying on the right side of the aisle that they say, well, you did this and therefore I'm no longer going to buy your products. Because it seems that there was an interesting study out of Harvard Business School, right, that kind of looked at how do people react to companies? And if a company was neutral, people were fine with it. If a company was liberal, people were fine with it. But if it turned out that the company was conservative, right, their popularity dropped, their fictional company, their popularity dropped by 30%. So for companies, it's like a win-win situation for at least the last couple of years, right? Conservatives didn't care, liberals did care. So they pandered to the side that was more willing to push back or to push into their ideological direction. And do you think that might change, right? That conservatives, if you forgive me the expression, are becoming more competitive, right? I wouldn't say that they grow balls, but they become more competitive and also say, listen, if you kind of boycott things we like, if you, as you correctly pointed out, that if you push actors off the air that we like, if you push radio shows, YouTube celebrities that are popular on the right of the air, that we're gonna attempt to do the same to you.
I don't. Well, so there's a lot to unpack there. And if anyone's interested, I also write a blog called The Naked Dollar, and the most recent piece that I wrote was an expose of the diversity industry, and it's become an industry. It has conferences and highly paid consultants, and so does a company like, let's talk about Coca-Cola. Does a company like Coca-Cola actually believe in this nonsense? The answer is, and I'm not inside Coca-Cola, but I think I know what's going on. There are probably a couple of key people inside the organization, probably on the board, and definitely in human resources. Human resources has become utterly corrupt. And if you wonder where social justice warriors go after they graduate, they go into human resource departments. So a couple of key players probably passionately believe this. And they believe that Coke must signal its virtue. And they probably pushed very hard internally for it. And the people inside, the other people who didn't necessarily buy in, were all afraid to raise their hands and say, wait a minute, this is nonsense. Because then they'd risk getting canceled. And getting canceled is a very, very real thing. It's very costly to people. The head of one of our soccer franchises retweet or liked a tweet that said all lives matter rather than Black Lives Matter. Just liked it. He didn't write the tweet. He lost his job. So this really happens. So as long as that's the environment, a lot of people are going to be afraid to stand up and say anything. Is this starting to happen in Europe?
Yes, right. Actually, I would even say that in some instances, it probably started here before it started in the United States. Particularly in Great Britain, you had many of these cases. There was one a case that got more public attention, where somebody was arrested for disturbing the public peace because they put a Union Jack into the window, and some people perceived the British flag as being offensive. So this is happening here as well. And we had a couple of, in Germany, there was one person who kind of put together a dossier about a politician who happened to be of diverse background, but who was blatantly lying on his CV. And the next thing that happened was that the police stood at the person who put together the dossier at his door, and they confiscated his computer, his cell phone, all these kind of things. In the end, nothing came of it, but it's a chilling effect, right? It's not, this is, I think, what's very often underestimated, exactly what you pointed out. In the worst case, it leads to people losing their jobs. But very often it's then social ostracization. It's you have to go to courts. It's kind of the process becomes the punishment, right? You drag somebody through court for 3 years, they have to pay 6-figure sums for the lawyers. And even if they win in the end, you say, well, the system worked. Yeah, but the person's life is probably still ruined.
Absolutely. Most bad ideas in the world come from academia. And it'll start with some professor somewhere who has an idea, and he writes a white paper and maybe creates a course around it. And then he presents the white paper at a regional conference. And then it sort of expands from there, and then it's taught by more people. And then some of the people, the undergraduates who buy into this nonsense, graduate, and then they go to human resource departments of the, so this is how these things metastasize. They're like brain or intellectual viruses. And unfortunately, social media, and with social media, I have a technology background also. And I thought social media was a wonderful force for good when it first sort of came on the scene. But now it's quite the opposite. So social media has accelerated this process, and progressives dominate social media, and conservatives can, get canceled very easily on social media. I lost my Twitter account for 12 hours because I retweeted a story from the New York Post about Hunter Biden, which was 100% factual.
Yeah.
But I was shut out of Twitter for, I think, retweeting hacked material or something. So social media is the great accelerant of wokeism, and we are. It's going to get worse before it gets better. There are people starting to fight back. There's liberals like Barry Weiss, and Naomi Wolf, of all people, who was a classmate of mine and a big feminist. She's pushing back. So it's starting to. You're starting to see it a bit, but these are very brave people, and there aren't enough of them yet.
I guess it's a little bit like trying to turn around an oil tanker, right? It's even if the movement starts, it still takes a long time until the movement is completed.
A good analogy, I would say.
I want to go back a little bit, kind of to lighten the mood a little bit, to go back to your book Campusland, because what I really enjoyed about it was first published in 2019. And it's a satirical yet hilarious story about how wokeness and political correctness engulf an innocent, and I would say somewhat naive professor of English literature. But what I really like about the book is that it seems to me that it's not. There is sympathy for almost all the characters in it. So it's I would recommend it even to somebody who would perceive themselves to be more kind of on the woke side, if you want. So it's not what I enjoyed very much. It's not in your face. I think very often with these kinds of stories and books, you can see the formula after the first 2 chapters, and you can predict exactly what's going to happen in the following chapters. And this is not how I experienced your book. That made it really enjoyable. The characters really come to life in a very sympathetic way. So I'm just really curious, and again, without giving away too much, because I don't want to prevent anybody from reading it for themselves, but while writing the book, who kind of was your favorite character in it, if you had someone, or someone you kind of felt closest to? Because it doesn't really have it kind of has, as you mentioned before, a villain, but it doesn't really have a hero or a protagonist in the classical sense.
They were all really fun to write. Except maybe you're right. I thought the protagonist was the professor that you mentioned. My editor thought it was Lulu, who's the sort of conniving socialite. It's a large cast of characters. The hardest one to write and the least fun one to write was the professor, because he was this sort of naive straight man, and I discovered that was much harder to write than the characters who were much more sort of out there and stronger characters, if you will. Lulu is my favorite character because she's a socialite wannabe from New York City who wants her picture in the glossy publications at parties and so forth. She wants to be an it girl. This is very much of a New York subspecies. And she comes from a moneyed background. And she views going to Dalton, and think of Dalton, and again, as a Yale stand-in, as sort of a dreary impediment to her ambitions. But her father really wanted her to go, and she was smart enough to get in. And she wants to be back in New York, working on her brand and becoming an Instagram influencer and so forth. And she's an awful person who doesn't have morals and ethics. But I love her because she quickly learns the landscape at Devon and learns how to take advantage of people who are much worse than she is. So for that reason, I really think she's fun and a wonderful character. Whenever I ask people, or if I'm addressing a group of people about Campusland, I always ask about Lulu because people have very strong reactions to her. Other people, I just have utter contempt for her. So it's kind of fun to see that a character can draw out such varied impressions from people.
I mean, she struck me as, I like your description, but when reading the book, she struck me kind of as the almost the most honest character in the book, right? It was the one character where the motives were very clear and they seemed to be most straightforward. And what I particularly also enjoyed about it was that we have now plenty of evidence also from social psychology, from studies in that area that say that, would you describe a little bit kind of also about her role, particularly her as being a female character, is that there is a lot of evidence for this, right? That for example, social media plays a completely different role, sometimes also, of course, a more destructive role in the life of girls than it does in the life of boys. And I think you also nicely contrast this in the way you describe the fraternities and the members of the fraternities.
Oh, I'll interject. My other character that I gave a loving treatment to was called the Mound, who was a fraternity brother. And, I was in the description of the fraternity in there was very much, very close to my own experience. Being in a fraternity, I was in sort of Yale's Animal House. The Mound, the greatest story about the Mound, and I wish I was creative enough to have come up with this on my own. But the wonderful thing about this story is that it actually happened. So
you don't say.
The Mound one day goes to, he has a paper he's got to write for art history. And he takes art history because he hears it's an easy course. And so the assignment is to go to the Devon Art Gallery and pick out an artist who's well represented and write a paper about the evolution of that artist's career. So he goes and he examines all the little cards next to all the paintings, and he finds that there's one artist who's very, very well represented at the art gallery. So he writes not a long paper, but he writes a paper about this artist's really long career and the many styles he painted in, and the artist's name was Circa. So that actually, one of my fraternity brothers actually did that. The story in the book is precisely as it happened. It almost sounds like an urban legend story, but it's a true story.
I mean, what does that tell us about higher education? I mean, doesn't it show that really at some point, whether it's Yale or, I mean, I got my advanced degree at the University of Kentucky, but at some point it's kind of a credential industry that you want to get the credentials, you want to kind of slap it on the wall or kind of signal to your potential employer that I went to this or that Ivy League, but that the actual, the high and mighty, what also Ephraim, the main character in the book, right? This high ideals of education and to imbue the value of literature and how it can help people to mature morally and intellectually. That this might have been the case in the past, but that now it's really like they are diploma mills, and they're cheaper diploma mills and more expensive diploma mills. But at some point, it seems that at least for some, that is what it has become.
Oh, if you are majoring in something that's outside of the STEM areas, the sciences and math areas at Ivy League schools, your education today is probably crap. And I wish that weren't true, but they've been utterly bastardized by woke ideology, but also they've just gotten easier. There was a study I saw where students today do something like less than half the homework that they did, a generation or two ago. It's just easier, which is unfortunate. But the follow up on that person who wrote the paper on Circa, just to show you life's not straightforward. He graduated number one in his Navy SEAL class after he graduated. from Yale. And then he went on later in life to found a prominent private school down in the Bahamas. So he rose above his rather modest academic beginnings.
Really, it shows, right, that maybe it's another thing, right, that has been out and discussed a lot, that due to the way society is structured, that particularly men, right, that we simply mature at later times, so that maybe we start university and college too soon, and that we are mentally not there yet to have the kind of mindset that would be necessary, particularly, as you said, right, maybe for fields outside of STEM.
I think so. I think the entire university model has to be reinvented at this point, and it is being reinvented. And I think a lot of particularly smaller liberal arts colleges are going to go bankrupt in the next 10 years.
But there's a somewhat of a more provocative question where would be very curious to hear your take on. Is it possible, and I say this with all carefulness, but that it's also an element of compensation, right? As you said, right, you have the STEM fields and the medical fields, right, where people who graduate in these fields, they make very clear contributions, if you right. A surgeon saves lives, an architect built something, hopefully that's then really there. But particularly the humanities and the social sciences, it's kind of, unless you are kind of the best philosopher, or the really writing influential books after you did literature, it's very hard to leave a mark. But political correctness, the ideology of wokeness, right? The idea that it's the humanities, the social sciences that can lead the fight against whether we talk about systemic racism or injustice in society, that it brings value, or at least a feeling of making a contribution that goes beyond, right, maybe what people in the STEM field are achieving. That it's a compensation for what they cannot reach in other areas is by the contributions, or at least the imagined contributions to the betterment and advancement of society.
Well, there are too many of these people, right? You have all these people getting degrees in social studies. And lots of them want to become professors, lots of them do. And then they have to write papers, white papers, and they increasingly write them on just absurd and silly things. And what the industry is rewarding now is a woke aspect to those papers. So you get things like a feminist perspective on climate change. You know, that's a real paper somebody wrote. And climate change apparently is biased against women. And I'm sure someone else has written a paper about how climate change is biased against Black people. So this is a kind of nonsense and utter intellectual rot that gets produced when there are just too many people pursuing these fundamentally unproductive professions. And I get the allure to become a professor. You know, as I said, I was an adjunct for a few years, and it's a very, very protective, cozy bubble to be in, the world of academia. And I wrote Campusland from that perspective because my protagonist, the English professor, desperately wants to stay in the cozy bubble. And the sort of setup to the novel is that he is up for tenure that year. The book takes place over one academic year. And so we sense right away that's going to be one of the big conflicts of the book. Does he get tenure or not? So anyway, it's a seductive world and a fundamentally counterproductive one for society, I think.
One kind of final question, or one of many final questions regarding the book. And I don't want to give away the ending, so this is something for our listeners to find out on their own. But given how the climate currently is and how things are, do you think that the story, if it would have happened in real life, would have turned out as it did in the novel, or that it probably would have had a, let's say, much darker ending for the protagonist?
Oh, gosh. Probably a darker ending for the protagonist. I think I didn't want it. The book is supposed to be fun to read and supposed to make you laugh. And so I couldn't really have a completely dark ending.
But did you think about it? Because that's when it came to there, as I said, I don't want to give it away, but there was almost apart from, and I can say this again, it's a really fun read. It's very enjoyable to read, but it doesn't leave, which is nice, right? Because I think this is a little bit what you also intended to do. It doesn't leave there is no painful aftertaste in the sense of that it ends tragically, or as I said, I don't gonna give away the ending, but it almost like it's almost too good to be true, right? It's almost too good to be true how it all turns out.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to comment without giving away much, but I didn't want to write a depressing book. I wanted to get across a point. It's very hard to write a book where you're trying to get across a point without being pedantic and hitting people over the head with whatever point you're making. So you want to make the point as easy a pill to swallow as possible, and maybe even swallow it with a little sugar. And that's, I knew going in it was going to be a challenge to pull off that balance. So I think in the end I had to have a light tone to do that. And so having the ending be one that was, it doesn't end up perfectly for everybody. As you said,
True.
There's a big cast of characters, and there is a denouement. But certainly where my protagonist was concerned, I couldn't leave him in the trash heap, which would have been more realistic to life, I suppose.
As I said, since it's a fun read, and I was wondering, because you mentioned a couple of names before, right? Whether it's Barry Weiss or with Andrew Sullivan, right? There's a couple of people who traditionally were on the left, and as you mentioned before, right, to seem to gradually speak also out against the dominance. And I think it's fair to say the sometimes outright totalitarian approaches by the ideology of wokeness. But I was wondering if the way that you approach it, right, that humor, that might be the best way to go about it. Because one thing that, and this was what many criticized before the term woke even existed, when it was all under the umbrella term of political correctness, that these people, by these people meaning those who subscribe to that ideology, they don't have a sense of humor, right? There's like this kind of anti-joke, right? That how do you tell a joke to a feminist? And the answer is that's not funny, right? And this is exactly this idea that it's kind of that if you look at it, and also what happened in recent days, and hopefully we'll have some time to talk about this as well. Like the math is racist, right? That 3 times 3 is not necessarily 9. We have kind of to take the social context into account. I mean, at some level, that's hilarious, right? It's threatening, but it's also hilarious at some point.
Well, I thought humor would be a good weapon. So I consider myself to be a culture warrior of sorts. I haven't been my whole life, but I've become one. And I thought I thought the best way to fight was with humor, because then people might laugh along the way, but then take home a couple of points of understanding with them. And you're absolutely right. One of my big beefs with the left is they're utterly humorless. Comedians will not go to campuses anymore because they'll get in trouble, because there's nothing they can say that won't offend somebody. So it's almost as if you have people who are addicted to taking offense, and they're addicted to being outraged. So they need something constantly to be outraged about. And this is why they never declare victory. Even when they get what they want, there has to be a new enemy, because that's the modus operandi. So the left is a revolution. The revolution is the point, right? And you never have a goal that can be attained, because you can never end the revolution.
There was this after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, there's this famous quote, I assume it's apocryphal, but supposedly it really happened, where the Ayatollah Khomeini said, "There are no jokes in Islam." And it seems to me a little bit that right, with woke culture, it's the same. There are no jokes in woke culture. And you mentioned comedians. I mean, you see it there as well. I sometimes feel, if you look at somebody like Stephen Colbert, for example, a good comedian, like Johnny Carson, for example, is laughter is a reaction you can't really control, right? If somebody makes a joke, even at the risk of it being inappropriate, if you cannot help yourself, but at least you have to chuckle, right? Then I would say the comedian has done the right thing. But these days, it's looking for applause lines, right? It's all prepared applause lines. You have kind of the predetermined groups that they're allowed to make fun of. You kind of can predict the jokes, right? It's all, for example, along the lines of that, everybody to the right of the Republican Party, sleeps with their cousins and has no teeth. And I assume that maybe was funny a couple of decades ago, but at some point it's as you said before, it's only virtue signaling. And I feel this is going to be the death of at least dominant comedy at the moment. And I feel maybe there would be again an open space. I mean, Dave Chappelle seems to have tried to move a little bit into that spot, right? That it is funny, right? These completely, stuck up. There are no jokes anymore. People, to some extent, they're hilarious.
Well, the villain of Campusland is a Black woman. And a number of people asked me, like, didn't you think I was being racist? And, how dare I do that? And my response to that is, if you're telling me there are certain groups of people that I can't make a Black person the bad guy or the bad woman in this case, I think that's racist, right? That's not treating people equally at all. And in this case, given the role that the person plays in the novel, they really had to be Black.
A little bit to go into something that you have also written about in the Wall Street Journal was what's happening also in the school system in the United States. It's not just kind of the university and college system, but it's also, for example, the Dalton School, which one of the protagonists and one of the main characters, Lulu, in your book, she goes to the Dalton School in New York, which is a real school. And there was some, let's say, upheaval in recent months, and you wrote about this in the Wall Street Journal. Could you just enlighten us a little bit of what was going on there?
Yeah, it's funny. It's just a coincidence that I ended up getting involved with this Dalton issue, and one of my main characters, Lulu, went to Dalton in my book. But if you get to know Lulu and your New York City private school landscape, and I come from that, that there's nowhere else she would have gone. So Dalton is a very elite private school. It's always been on the more progressive end. In New York City, and someone on the inside leaked to me and my blog a list of demands written by the faculty, and it was 8 pages long, and it's all critical race theory stuff. So if your listeners aren't familiar with critical race theory, they should probably get up to speed, because it is one of these ideas that we were talking about earlier in our conversation that has sort of busted out of the confines of academia and is now infecting broader society. And critical race theory is the opposite. Think of it as the opposite of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was all about judging people as individuals and content of their character and not the color of their skin. Critical race theory is the exact opposite. It means to separate us all by skin color, define us by skin color. Skin color is the first and last thing to consider about people. It's incredibly divisive and corrosive and gets everybody angry at everybody else. And it has taken over schools everywhere and corporations. I mean, critical race theory is by the whole Coca-Cola is behind the whole Coca-Cola nonsense. Dalton just happened to be a particularly egregious example. And people ask me, why did I get involved with it? I started blogging about it, and the first blog I wrote immediately went viral. And was then reported in the New York Post and in British newspapers and everywhere. I got involved with it not because I particularly care about Dalton. I have nothing to do with Dalton, but Dalton is an example of what's going on everywhere, and people don't seem to understand it. In the wake of George Floyd, and with the distraction of COVID, the cultural needle has been moved further in 7 or 8 months in the United States than it has in any similar period in our nation's history. And people aren't even realizing quite what's going on. And it's dangerous, awful stuff. And I would encourage anyone to go on my blog, The Naked Dollar, and you can go back to about mid-December when I wrote the first piece on Dalton, and you can sort of follow the thread from there just by going through the blogs. And I describe, for instance, what the word equity means. You hear the word equity a lot now. It doesn't mean equality. Equity means equal results. And to get equal results, basically you have to knock some people down, because you can't elevate everybody up to the highest level. So to get equal results, you have to knock people down. This is basic Marxism. And so when you see the word equity, think Marxism. And I explain it much more cogently than I am now in my blog, in a piece that I wrote about a month ago. But it's all there and easy to find.
Do you believe that that's what I'm sometimes wondering, is this, for example, when we look at something like critical race theory, right? That's, by the way, I think that's also important to mention. There are plenty of people that are not like the two of us, right? So white middle-aged men, so to say. There is John McWhorter, there is Glenn Lowry, so there is Thomas Sowell, there is Walter Williams, or the late Walter Williams, unfortunately. So there have been plenty of people with from the African American side and others that say that critical race theory is really a problem, exactly what you just mentioned, because it's a divisive ideology that tries to group people by skin color and then kind of derive from that skin color the way the government should treat them and treat them differently. But is it a vocal minority that cudgels a majority into silence, or is this something that really has 51% support, so to speak, within broader academia? This is something I still have a really hard time to grasp, and I don't know what is true.
I would say it's split. I mean, this is going on at Princeton right now also. I mean, there is a letter written by a lot of the faculty asking for the same sorts of things that the Dalton faculty is asking for. Patently outrageous stuff, patently illegal things, right? Giving money to certain groups of people because of their skin color and not giving money to other groups of people because they have a different skin color. Patently illegal. But this is, promoted in critical race theory and part of the whole concept of equity. I think it's probably split. If I had to say, I think it's probably, if you got an honest answer out of all these professors, I'd say half totally agree with it and half are scared of it and think it's awful. But a significant portion of that half is scared to say anything and will even go as far as signing these letters in agreement because they're afraid they'll be run out of their jobs. It's happening to one guy right now at Princeton, one of the professors there, same as Katz, I believe, who ironically and coincidentally went to Dalton. So he's speaking up about it, and they're trying to run him right out of Princeton. So we have an environment where people. It's the opposite of free inquiry and debate, which universities are supposed to excel at, and it's really disturbing stuff, honestly.
Do you believe that the kind of woke coalition can hold together in itself? I think the new term that is very often used is that the BiPOC, right, or BiPOC. I'm never entirely sure how to pronounce it, but I also know the native English speaker, so I have that excuse. But it's like Black, Indigenous, and people of color. But if you look at what's happening in certain areas, one example is Asian American, right? I mean, there's pretty good evidence by now that when it comes to admissions to elite schools, elite universities, there is discrimination against Asian Americans. Then you have, women would be the next thing, right? I think lots of the movement also now from the new administration under Joe Biden. I mean, a lot of this is basically the abolition of women's sports, right? This idea that a man or a biological male who identifies as a woman, right, should also have the right to participate in women's sports. And again, the examples we have is if you had your body exposed to testosterone for most of your young adult life, you have a significant advantage, which in the United States, of course, important for our listeners to know. This means to be on top in sports in high school means scholarships, means an ability to go to prestigious universities. So all these groups, Asian Americans, women, transgender, right, that are all be part of the woke coalition. I mean, if you dig a little deeper, it turns out not all of them are particularly fond of each other.
Oh, well, so you're coming back to Campusland now.
Yes.
And
it's one of my favorite scenes.
I had so much fun writing this. I know which scene you're talking about, and I had so much fun writing that. And I realized when you have an environment where it's 100% dominated by the left, you're going to have factions, right? Because there's spoils to be had, especially in a big university like Yale or Harvard, where there's so much money around, or there's a lot at stake. And so these leftist groups will naturally splinter. And what you've seen over the years is sort of greater and greater specialization. And there was a gay pride movement, and gay split into LGBT, and then it was LGBT IAQ, and then now you almost need to know the alphabet, sing the alphabet song to go through the letters. There are now over 70 genders. When I had some fun with that in Campusland too. And when I wrote Campusland, there were only 51 or 2 genders, I think, and now they're in the 70s. So you have this fracturing on the left, and their interests aren't necessarily aligned. In particular, Asians are kind of getting the shaft here. And if you also look at the Dalton demands and the Princeton demands, it's all about blacks, really. In fact, blacks now, the New York Times and the Washington Post, and even the Wall Street Journal, except on the editorial page, they're capitalizing black. But the rest of us have to suffer the indignity of lowercase. So the part of the movement, and reparations is another example, they're throwing the other minorities kind of under the bus. And the Asians have woken up first, and the Asians are pushing back. But pretty soon, the feminists are going to push, right? They're starting to push back a bit on dudes competing with them, because that's what's happening with the trans movement. It is so hard to keep up with because it's moving so quickly. And we now have an administration in Washington that is catering to the whims of those who want to move it really far and fast. So this will all devolve into a big intramural, messy fight. And perhaps at that point, the best thing to do is to step aside and let them all go at each other.
It's like in the most recent Godzilla movie, right? So let them fight, and kind of hope that it's gonna turn out. I mean, there's just, because I don't want to keep you for too long, but as a final question, to also look at what this means politically. There has, and this is of course currently still a topic that's full of landmines, but wasn't this also a reason? And this is also in Europe. I had discussions here in Austria with people that say, it's the myth of cancel culture and the myth of political correctness, right? This is just something that the right makes up to kind of excuse their abhorrent behavior. But if we look at the last 4 years in American politics, and particularly in 2016, also the election of Donald Trump, wasn't this, at least to some extent, also a repudiation? And again, we all know how 2020 ended, and of course, again, none of this makes the events of January 6th less evil and less tragic. But I think very often we don't see the forest for the trees, and there was such a focus on the person of Donald Trump that very often it seems that we overlooked why people voted for him. And I think one motivation was, it was, if you will, a middle finger to this kind of wokeness, political correctness, this idea that there's only a certain group that can speak freely. And what I found so interesting in 2020 is it's still small, but you saw these shifts happening also in the Latino community, in the Black community, in the Muslim community, in the Asian American community. Like, more of them voted for Donald Trump in 2020 than they did in 2016. And as a final point here, the immediate reaction was, right, one was by Nicole Hannah-Jones of the New York Times to say, well, Cubans are not really Latinos, they're not really Hispanic, they're actually white. And the next group said, well, Jews are not, they're actually also white. And Asian Americans, well, they're actually also white. So this is going to backfire at some point, because there's no reason for these groups to ever go back to a party that not only that first looks at them only in racial categories, and if they don't behave the way they're supposed to, which mostly means vote on the left, they get pushed into a completely different racial group. All of a sudden, the Cuban is actually white, which I guess comes as a surprise to many Cuban Americans.
Well, the Dalton demands, the Princeton demands, and woke culture demands in general, they want to create a permanently oppressed class or classes. And it's cultural Marxism, and the difference between cultural Marxism and traditional Marxism is the oppressed in traditional Marxism were economic classes, and the oppressed in cultural Marxism are classes of skin color, or in some cases, gender. So what they want to do is take Black people, for instance, and make them a permanently oppressed victim class. And if I'm a Black person, and I'm not, but I'm going to hypothesize here or imagine I might be, I'd be really annoyed by that. I don't want to be your victim. And Walter Williams, who you mentioned earlier, had a great quote. He said, "I'm glad I got educated before white people decided to care." And I thought that was a great quote because, the whole idea of the sort of the savior white people coming to help you poor Black people. If I'm a Black person, I'm kind of offended by that, and I want to make it on my own, and I want you to remove traditional obstacles that there have been for me to make it, but I don't want your patronizing wokeness either. So I agree. I think the last election, the election of Trump, was you're right, a big middle finger, mostly from the flyover country, and there's a huge realignment that's happening, and the working class have all become Republicans, interestingly, and the coastal elites, who traditionally were thought of as sort of country club Republicans, they've all become Democrats. It's been a complete reversal. Say what you want about Trump, but he is a seminal historic figure that caused a tremendous amount of change in America, and an immense political realignment.
That's really my last question, but what you mentioned before, I think it fits so nicely into this topic, because we started the conversation a little bit talking also about the Marxist roots of wokeness as an ideology, but this fits so nicely because originally, if you want, the object of affection of the left was the working class, and it turned out that just as it's, I think, with many minorities, that the working class was not really what those who wanted to act on their behalf believed they are, right? Again, you had a rather educated, economically independent, or upper scale intellectual class that decided they will now speak for the working class, right? They will represent the interests of the working class. And it turned out that whether it was the World Revolution or other things, the working class really didn't have that much of an interest in it. So they then moved on. We had the same, and this is something that also happens in Europe, is that the working class, this is what I meant initially when I said that Europe in some respects kind of was ahead in a good or a bad way of the US, that the working class has already turned to the right here because they were no longer of interest to the particularly to the left elites, and they moved now on. In Europe, it's particularly minorities with a Muslim background and migration from those areas, whereas in the United States, it's Latinos, the Black community, and other groups. But it's very often exactly what you said, and I wish that we would talk more often about this. And it's very often well-to-do white elites who present themselves as being the spokesperson for these groups, with whom they probably share less in common than cross-racial members of the working class.
Oh, well, they have utter contempt for the working class, right? They're smelly Walmart shoppers. That's how they view them, who drive pickup trucks and probably joined the NRA, and so they don't even pretend anymore. The working class used to be what needed to be saved by the leftist elite, and they've now moved on, and you can just sort of substitute skin colors and gender for the working class, and you have the new Marxism. And it's really the same playbook with just a twist. And the ultimate goal is centralized control and globalization. And it's so rife with contradictions and messy intellectual nonsense that makes no sense whatsoever when you really analyze it. But there's this enduring appeal about Marx, who was a nut in the British Library, and none of this stuff has worked or panned out. In fact, it's killed hundreds of millions of people. But there's this enduring appeal to it because, it's it's a shortcut to power for some people. It goes to their heads.
Last question, Campusland. When can I look forward to the second volume?
So I am working on another book. It's not a sequel. If Campusland is about piercing the smug bubble of academia, I was casting him out for a different smug bubble that I could go after and settled on the world of contemporary art. So I'm working on a book that I would describe as the mob meets the world of contemporary art. It looks around and says, why aren't we involved in this?
All right, Mr. Johnston, author of Campusland and the Naked Dollar blog, thank you so much for taking time to talking to us. It was a pleasure.
I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.